Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the uncompromising libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Welcome back, Richard.
Great to be, as always.
Hey, well, we've been discussing central planning, this aspect of socialism that a lot of people, I think, don't give a whole lot of thought to. I thought we'd continue with that theme and specifically talk about public schooling, or as some might call it, government schooling, because it seems to me that it would be difficult to find a better example of socialist central planning than this construct, this idea of public government schooling. In fact, as you well know, public schooling is a core element in such socialist countries as North Korea, Cuba, China, and, effectively every one of them. And I think it would be difficult to find a better example of socialist central planning. You've got a central board of commissars, so to speak, at a national level, Department of Education, or at a state level, Department of Education, a local level, the local school board, that is planning in a top-down fashion as compared to a free market the educational decisions of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of school children. So I don't think there's any surprise that you've had this constant decades-long series of crises and chaos in public schooling, because isn't this what always happens with socialist central planning? What do you think, Richard?
Well, I agree. The fact is that, as you pointed out, the general template is the idea of government central planning. Then there are the particular forms that it takes. It can take central planning of our health care, central planning of our retirement, central planning of our housing, central planning of virtually anything, and education. The success of the government's indoctrination is shown, let me suggest, by the fact of how difficult it is for Americans, virtually people anywhere in the world, but certainly our fellow citizens here in the United States, to even conceive of some type of an educational system that would not have government as the primary component in requiring attendance, determining the curriculum, licensing and approving of the teachers and professors in the classroom. But it need not be this way. The fact is that people first became literate without government mandate, control, or planning. If I can just use an historical example, there was a famous economic historian, now passed away several years, named Edwin West, E.G. West, and he wrote a book called Education and the State. It's still available in a very inexpensive edition from Liberty Fund in Indianapolis. And what E.G. West points out among the general argument about education is that between 1790 and around 1830, two-thirds to three-quarters of the entire British population was made literate without government mandate, control, or supervision. This was done by the private sector, a good part of it by religious schools, where the idea was you would train young people to be able to read the Bible, to have the message of morality and religion in it. But there were also private secular schools, as well as for-profit schools. All of them were working hard at this. Now, what was the advantage or the purpose of such education? There was the general one that most people believed in, who were informed and had a little bit of education themselves, that if you want an intelligent and informed citizenship, people who can understand the nature of the society in which they live, the politics under which they are ruled, it is necessary to have a literate population who can think about the ideas about government, its role in society, what freedom means, and so on. There was also the growing industrial revolution. People were leaving the agricultural areas and coming to the factories, the early industrial revolution situation. And that required more educated and literate and trained people to work in the factories, the enterprises, and manufacturing. And that made it advantageous from the employer's point of view to see that people were paying attention to learning a basic education, as well as to have that type of literacy for themselves and their children. For instance, in many cases in these factories, sort of at the head of the shop floor, there would be a platform with a desk. and one of the workers would be sitting up there and reading the newspaper to the workers as they were working on the machines doing their activities. Partly this was to sort of break the monotony, to keep them awake, but most importantly, this was so to make more educated and literate and informed the working population. And then the reading of the newspaper in front of the rest of the workers would be rotated among the employees so that they could have practice reading and speaking out loud. All of this was done without the state in a competitive and effective way. Now, why did it get taken over by the state? Well, the major drive of this, or the model for it, was already occurring in the very early part of the 19th century in Prussia, in Central Europe. The Kaiser, the Emperor of Prussia, was determined that he was going to make obedient, loyal, and serving subjects that would not question the political and social institutions of society. Everybody would know their place. And that was the first modern mandatory system of education. That then became the model, for instance, for the United States. Why? We are a country of immigrants, wave of immigrants. It's estimated that between 1840 and 1914, about 35 million people came mostly from Europe to the United States. Now, the people who were there before said, all these foreigners are coming. They speak different languages. They come from different religions, different cultures. How do we know that they could become real Americans, that their children will be integrated? So we're now going to force all of them into mandatory schooling. We're going to make the case for compulsory education, where there will be a single curriculum, a single way of teaching and learning that will then be imposed upon all young people so that they will be molded into our conception, our vision, our political view of good Americans. And that became the template. Now, if I can just continue with this in a minute to show this. When I was young, a mere whippersnapper, I was in grammar school, and you take a history course, and what did you learn? Well, there was one lesson that schools everywhere in the country taught, and that was that Christopher Columbus was a great man and a hero. Why was he a great man and a hero? Because he discovered America, and then that opened the continent to the settlement of the continent to create the new America, and eventually the United States, a growing country, a progressive country, an industrialized country. And the history textbooks would show the factories with the smoke billowing out of the chimneys, and that would all be seen signs of the great progress of American industrialization. Now, what do the textbooks tell us, right? Fast forward, well, we'll just say a few decades. Fast forward several decades. And what do we see today in the textbooks? Christopher Columbus was a bad man. Yes, he did not have respect for the Native Americans. And all these diseases were brought. And they harmed the land and hurt the little animals. And they had no respect for the sea otters and the little bunnies. And it's terrible that all of this happened. Yes, if there's a criminal who should be put on trial in The Hague, it's Christopher Columbus, because he destroyed half of the world. Now, I know I'm being sarcastic and ridiculing in its own, but it's that mindset. But what's important is not just the mindset, but it is a controlled agenda of a curriculum that pervades much of the learning process in compulsory education. X number of decades ago, Christopher Columbus is a hero, because that's the intellectuals and the political elite's conception of America. Now they're down on that view. And now Christopher Columbus and industrialization is a destruction of the land and the Native Americans. And now he's a criminal. But all that, the same mindset. There's no competition. There's no challenging of ideas to see, well, maybe a little bit of this and maybe a little bit of that, or maybe a little of neither one. But there's this idea of homogenized propagandizing. This has been indicative of the 20th century. For example, shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, Vladimir Lenin, the head of the communists, was setting up his new revolutionary government, which included a Ministry of Education. And the first minister of Soviet education said in a public statement that the purpose of the system was to take the young people of Russia and mold them like wax into the shape and form that will serve our purposes for the new socialist utopia to come. And this is the conception. You propagandize the young to make them in a socially designed fashion that fits your ideology. Now, there's a lot of things wrong with public education. We can go into that. How it's taught, the curriculum, whether it really gets the students literate. But overlaying that, with all of those other problems, is the idea of a monopolization of an ideology through compulsory attendance and sucking the parents in to think that there is no alternative other than the state providing for the schooling of their children.
Yeah, and given the fact that it's monopolistic in structure, I mean, these kind of conflicts of what should be taught are inherent to the system. It's the majority rule. If the majority happens to believe that Christopher Columbus is a bad man, well, that's got to be imposed on the students. Or if he's a good man, that's what's imposed. Well, compare that to a free market where the state has no role in education at all. If people want to send their kids to a school that teaches that Christopher Columbus was a bad man, they can do it. They want to send them to another school, great. They want to send them to a music school or homeschool or whatever. I mean, that's the virtues of a free market, is that it's not a cookie cutter mold, that the parents are able to treat each child as somebody unique who has different interests, different tastes. And the idea, Richard, always is, oh, well, you've got to teach kids a basic education. They need to learn how to read and write, and that's really what the big advantage of public schooling is. And yet, when you look at every single child from 0 to 6, from birth to 6, every child seeks knowledge. I mean, you see it in their eyes, and when they're little babies, they're looking around, absorbing everything. By the time they reach 6, they're bedeviling their parents with that one word, why. Every child has this natural thirst to understand, to seek knowledge. In fact, that word, educate, is derived from the Latin word educare, which means to seek. So in a natural educational system, a free market educational system, it would be based on children seeking knowledge, seeking information. They get passionate about something. Hey, teach me about dinosaurs. Okay, I'll take you to the library. We'll check out a bunch of books on dinosaurs. And then that passion starts extending outward into other fields. That's as compared to the public school system, which is really a cramming process. It's let us feed all this information into your head, which you're going to memorize and regurgitate. And if you ask me what the worst aspect of public schooling is, Richard, it destroys that natural love of learning. That by the time a kid gets out of school at 18, he hates learning, he hates reading, he can't wait to get out of school. It's a great big hassle for him. And it's the rare person that rediscovers that thirst for learning, that gets passionate about certain things in his life and starts seeking and studying and learning again. And that's not because of public schooling, it's in spite of public schooling.
Well, I agree. I think that we need to remember that one of the great virtues of the market is, as Friedrich Hayek called it, competition is a discovery procedure. It is, if we knew the outcome of a race before it was held, who'd come in first, who'd come in second, the relative time and the times of the runners, what would be the point of holding a race? We hold a race because we can never be sure who can do better the next time, or who will come on the field who never placed before in the past. Now, the same thing, Hayek argued, is in the marketplace. It is only through the competitive process that we discover who can do what the best, or in a different way, or less expensively, or to serve consumer demands that no one had imagined before, and better than the peaceful rivalry of his competitors. The same thing, I would argue, applies to education. How do we know the best methods to awaken interest and excitement in young people to want to learn and to become more informed, to want to read, for example, to want to take mathematics or the sciences seriously as not something that may not just be difficult, but something fascinating and rewarding? Because what people are saying, oh, American students are bad at math and the sciences. Then why don't we know how to teach these things better, whether it be from kindergarten through the 12th grade? It's because we have a homogenized system of a monopoly curriculum with a particular conception of how classes should be taught. In the marketplace, you'd have competitors. Let's try this curriculum. Let's try these teaching methods. And then over time, obviously not overnight like any other competitive process, but over time, the schools that were less effective at this would be weeded out, like the bad competitor in any facet of the market. And who would be rewarded with greater profits, more interest in students attending, an opportunity to expand their facilities to wider areas of the society to educate people. Those who had demonstrated through a track record of effective competition that they know how to make students want to learn and for them to successfully learn in the avenues. One other element of this is that this idea of diversity of competition depoliticizes and deconflictizes much in the society. Now, over the last several decades, we've seen a lot of conflicts in the school systems around the United States. Shall it be creationism or evolutionary theory in the sciences? Shall every student at the beginning of the school day stand up and do a pledge of allegiance to the flag, or shall they not? Are you going to allow people to wear religious symbols, a cross or a Star of David, and so on, in classes or school or not? That's only because it's a monopoly system. Everyone is forced to go whether they like it or not, and those who can get control of that school board then imposes their value systems, if they're determined to believe in them strongly enough, on everyone. But in a competitive arena, you send your kid to the school that has the curriculum and content and allows representation of symbols that you value or don't want. And that depoliticizes it and eliminates conflict. You want your kid to go to this school, he goes to that school. You want your kid to go to that school, you go to this school. It's the same logic, I would suggest, as with religion. When there was the government imposing one faith on people, all dissent was repressed. And that created conflict in society and an underground effort to maintain your belief system against the politicized monopoly that was imposed upon you and everyone else. But we don't have these problems. You want to go to a Catholic church, you want to go to a Protestant denomination, you want to go to a synagogue, you want to go to a mosque, you want to go no place. It's privatized, it's depoliticized, and therefore creates no conflicts and avenues for everyone to have their beliefs concerning religion to be satisfied without imposing it upon others. The same logic applies to these similar issues in education as well. But people need to realize that this can all be fulfilled and an educated and literate youth for their offspring without the state dominating and controlling all of this in this monopolistic and compulsory fashion.
Yeah, I think your point about religion is absolutely excellent because, you know, in religion, we've developed a high degree of tolerance as far as how people raise their children. You know, some people will send their kids to church every Sunday, others don't. Some parents teach their kids that atheism is the way to go. And the fact is that most people probably disagree with how other people are raising their children in most instances. But there's this toleration that we've developed as Americans of saying, well, okay, I don't agree with how that child's being raised, but they have a right to raise the child the way you want. And hopefully the child will figure things out as he goes along and becomes an adult. We don't have that same degree of tolerance in education, and we have to have it in order to achieve the free society where people will educate their children in different ways, that unapproved ways where most everyone else might not agree, but that same degree of tolerance that we get in the area of religion, we need to apply to education. Because let's face it, Richard, there's really no way to define objectively an educated person. There's different standards for education. Is a person who knows everything about farming but can't read a book, is he an educated person? Well, the standard definition would be no, he can't read. But yet here he knows everything there is about farming, can produce the greatest crops in the world. Who's to say he's not educated in accordance with what he's passionate about and able to do? And I think it's that sense of tolerance is that once we regain that or capture that people will finally say, oh, okay, if we have a separation of church and state, how about a separation of school and state as well? And in fact, we had that kind of system throughout the 1800s. A lot of Americans don't realize that there wasn't this system of public schooling until compulsory education came into existence in Massachusetts in the 1850s. And then later you got public schooling systems in the late 1800s. In fact, it comes to mind that we published many years ago when you were Vice President of Academic Affairs for FFF. Do you recall that great little 3-part series by Blumenfeld on why compulsory education laws are bad? Something like that. Mm-hmm. It's on our website at fff.org. I think it was Samuel Blumenfeld was his first name. But fantastic 3-part series showing the history of compulsory attendance laws in the United States and how horrible they were.
Yes. I think that we should, in making these criticisms, we should also highlight the positive, right? You got to accentuate the positive, as Johnny Mercer in his song said long ago. There has been a change in people's thinking about this. It's not a society-wide great change, but a noticeable and significant change. If we could go back into a time machine, let's say 40 or 50 years ago, and we could ask people, what do they think of those families that want to homeschool their children? Kook, nut, crazy person. He or she cannot be allowed to do that. Now today, homeschooling is certainly still a minority choice in the American population, but it certainly is a lot larger than it was 40 or 50 years ago, and it has more acceptance. I guess is it already 10 years ago, Time magazine had a cover article about the homeschooling movement. And while they weren't particularly sympathetic about it, they did say that this was a trend which people were becoming more convinced was the best way to educate and prepare their children for the future. That is a sea change. The growth of private schools, even though it is still government controlled and overseen, even the charter school movement. What is important here is the idea that people want choice. They don't want their child to go to a school that has been mandated in terms of a district boundary by a state government, when they would rather have their child, if they have any type of a choice, to send their child to the school that they think will give them the education that will prepare them for the rest of their life. Because you really only get one shot as a young person for schooling. So whether it be the charter schools, which of course is not a fully privatized system, obviously, or private schools or homeschooling, this itself is a sea change in the beginning of people thinking about, does government have to be the monopoly controller of how my child becomes an adult and has levels of education and knowledge to prepare them for their own life? This should not be overlooked or just set aside. It is a major change, slowly but surely, happening among a growing segment of the U.S. population.
I agree with you, but still, it's not a free system. I mean, a free system is one in which the state plays no role at all. A lot of the homeschooling, it's fantastic, but a lot of it's government approved, where you have to go and submit your curriculum and so forth, and it better satisfy the government officials. And let's face it, some parents are not competent to homeschool. They don't feel comfortable doing it. And so in a truly free market, you'd have educational vehicles popping up for parents that say, look, I love the idea of not being forced into a government institution, but I don't want to homeschool myself. And so, here, look at this wide array of things. And you'd have entrepreneurs vying for consumer businesses with this wide array of choices. And so that's why we as libertarians are always standing apart from conservatives who seem to be satisfied with a mixture of government coercive systems, where we just want a totally free system, a separation of school and state entirely. And one of the interesting aspects of the homeschooling movement, as you'll recall, when it was first getting started, the state was saying, oh, no, parents are not competent to homeschool. We can't do this. This would result in children not getting educated. And, of course, the question I asked during that period of time, well, how come all these parents are not competent to handle the educational decisions of their children? Aren't they all graduates of public schooling? And if the public schooling produces this entire generation of parents that are incompetent to handle educational decisions for their children, what does that say for the public school system? And why do we want to continue repeating this pattern for future generations?
I agree that the ultimate goal on the horizon is a total separation of education from the state. My point in emphasizing this was the fact that there has to be sort of a social and a psychological beginning of a change in the population to want to lose confidence in the existing system. And it is this developing attitude among people to at least consider the possibility that the state does not have to fully control it. For example, let's suppose that you, Jacob Hornberger, had been my slave for decades. And now, someone comes along and says, well, maybe Hornberger should be free. Oh, but, is he intelligent enough to do his own shopping, to get his own job? And, well, but he's a human being. Shouldn't he have a little bit of choice? And so, yeah, let's see if he can tie his own shoes. Okay, but you have to get people to at least think that Hornberger should be free. And finally, guess what? You're let go, and you're your own man. And it's that sense I meant about the idea of how people look upon this. By the way, can you tie your own shoes? Oh, okay, let's not get into that. But
Richard, I can tell that you're a graduate of public schools just because of these inane examples and hypotheticals that you bring up.
But the thing is, you see, Hornberger has finally gotten ready for freedom. So people start admitting the fact that, maybe people can homeschool. Maybe people could do this. But you're right. As long as the state is involved, it hampers, restricts, and implicitly controls the direction, structure, and content of the education. For example, I have been a professor of economics for now decades. I like to think that I'm competent and knowledgeable in explaining the ideas and conveying their importance in a way that the students learn and find interesting. But I cannot teach in, let's say, a junior high school or high school. Why? Because I don't have an education. I don't have a teaching certificate. I've not gotten a degree in education. So regardless of my competency and knowledge and ability, the fact is that a high school, and in fact many private high schools, can't hire me because I don't have a state-issued license. This is a way of controlling and manipulating who are the teachers, how have they been trained, and what is the content of that, therefore what they give to the students. All of this should be done away with. The market should be totally free from the state. All that, with all other aspects, what is the role of government? To protect us from violence and fraud. If there's no violence and fraud involved, then the state should have no question of involvement, intrusion, or investigation into the affairs of private schools any more than the other aspects of people's private lives. But we at least see people changing their thinking about the possible, and hopefully that can move us towards that point on the horizon that the classical liberal libertarian believes to be the ideal, and that is the separation of education from the state.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. All these people that are going into homeschooling, that are in private schools and taking their kids out of the public school system, they're questioning the system. And that's a real positive. And you're right, that's a real sea change. And the more people that are questioning the system, the better off we are, because it accelerates the day when the entire system can be dismantled. Now, in this regard, a lot of parents have kids that rebel against this system. They just naturally resist it. They don't do well. They're distracted. And they're called in, the parents are called in for counseling, and the state administrators inevitably say, look, your child has attention deficit disorder. Something's wrong with him. We need to put him on Ritalin or Adderall or some kind of mind-altering substance to get his mind straight, because we're here trying to make him into a good little citizen. And so he's resisting this good little system, and so we got to put him on drugs. And the good parent will say, to heck with you. And they'll take their child out. And a lot of parents have, and all of a sudden they notice their child, advancing tremendously in a private system in terms of learning and education. Unfortunately, all too many parents, because of public schooling and the deference to authority mindset that they came with the regimentation in public schooling, they defer to authority and say, okay, put my kid on Adderall, put him on Ritalin, and they end up screwing the kid up. Well, it seems to me, Richard, that these kids that are diagnosed as something wrong are really the ones that have their heads on straight. They know it's instinctively that something's not right with this system of coercion, regimentation, indoctrination, and they act it out in terms of their so-called attention deficit disorder. The parent, if he's doing the right thing, should recognize that the kid's right, get his kid out of there, because of the destruction that this system does to the kid, which the kid instinctively is recognizing.
Yes, absolutely. The part of the problem is that we now have had, as you pointed out, compulsory education came in a massive way in the United States, beginning in the very, well, obviously, like you said, in Massachusetts in the middle of the 19th century, but really in the late 19th and 20th century. That's where compulsory education was pervasively imposed upon the entire country, before even the federal involvement now with the Department of Education. And that means that we have now several generations of parents who themselves have only known a government educational system. Well, that's what I had. That's what my parents had. Isn't that necessary to make us good Americans and be able to go out in the world to be a self-supporting and contributing member of the society? And that is a mindset that is very difficult to break. That is why every government that wants to really control and command a society has a ministry of propaganda. And the ministry of propaganda is to try to narrow other sources of knowledge that the people receive and limit them to what the state wants them to hear. Now, we see the extreme forms of it in history, like Nazi Germany, right? Goebbels, the minister of propaganda under Hitler, or the propagandizing in the Soviet Union, where they hermetically sealed the society from any knowledge or information that they could physically and successfully do other than what they wanted the people to learn, to believe that their society was better and capitalism in America was corrupt and terrible. Now, we are a freer society. We are, quote, a democratic society. We're not a totalitarian society. But it doesn't change the fact that there is an elite in the government bureaucracies, of which obviously the Department of Education is a prominent one. And there are the state boards of education, the local school district committees and commissions. All of these result in a situation in which they attempt to indoctrinate parents in believing there's no alternative. Even if we allow a little bit of homeschooling and private schools, there's no core alternative other than the state serving as the conduit through which children enter society through their schooling. And that mindset has to be broken. It's not easy, but until we do, they're going to control the ideas of the society to a greater extent than has to be the case, and will always make it extremely difficult for us as advocates of liberty to break through.
Yeah, I'm reminded when you mention Nazi Germany, I forget the exact words that Hitler used, but somebody asked him about, how he was looking at changing Germany, and he was talking about people resisting his philosophy, and he says, "Don't worry, it's just a matter of time. We have your children already." And the idea was, hey, now we have the children. We have 12 years to mold them into believing whatever we want them to believe. And then there's that other great quote. I don't know who said it, but it was something to the effect of, better not to be educated at all than to be educated by the state. And it's that same notion that you're better off not getting educated. And, of course, we're not saying that at all. We'd say a free market would educate people tremendously, but rather that than the state destroying you with indoctrination.
Yes. See, this all emerged, the wider ideological setting emerged out of the French Revolution. The king was overthrown in 1789. A revolutionary government came to power in France. They wanted to remake society in a new anti-monarchy image. The people would rule. The society would belong to the people. And the society is defined by the nation to which they are a part. And early on in the French Revolution, in the early 1790s, they set up a new ministry and department of education. And they specifically said that children are no longer to be viewed as owned by their parents. They belong to the nation as a whole. The parents are merely trustees and stewards who are allowed to have presence in the student's life, the children's life, only for as long as it's compatible with what the state requires of the child, and which will begin to teach them what is required through a mandatory educational system. So this is part of an ideology of collectivism, that the individual is not a free person, that the family is not a unique and independent unit separate from the state, but all are the assets of the government, and the government nurtures the assets to have value to serve the political purposes of the nation. And that is the core problem of this: collectivism, nationalism, and the socialization of the human being away from his notion of being an independent individual who has a right to his own life.
Yeah, which brings us back to the whole idea of central planning, the socialist concept. And on that note, we'll wrap things up. But let me just say that what we libertarians are fighting for then is a separation of school and state, the way our ancestors achieved the separation of church and state, the repeal of all compulsory attendance laws, no more school buildings, no more school state buildings, state textbooks, state curricula, total free market in education. It's really the key to a free society. That's what we're fighting for as libertarians. On that note, Richard, enjoyed the conversation this week.
Till next time.
Okay, and we'll see you next week. This is this issue of the Libertarian Angle.